All right. Hello. Thank you for waiting patiently. So, my name, for your purposes, is Booker, and today I will be reading The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I was about to get to that. My good friend, the Angry Noodle, has recently convinced me to give something a try, and that is going to be reading a book live on stream. It's something very new to me, and it's a bit of an experiment. So I hope that you will enjoy this, and I hope that I will too. If you enjoyed this, if you think it's worthwhile, let me know, and I may do it some more. Alright, without further ado, let's begin. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 98 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet whose ape-descended life forms are so amazingly primitive that they still think digital watches are a pretty neat idea. This planet has, or rather had, a problem, which was this. Most of the people living on it were unhappy for pretty much of the time. Many solutions were suggested for this problem, but most of these were largely concerned with the movements of small green pieces of paper, which is odd because on the whole, it wasn't the small green pieces of paper that were unhappy. And so the problem remained. Lots of people were mean, and most of them were miserable, even the ones with digital watches. Many were increasingly of the opinion that they'd made a big mistake in coming down from the trees in the first place, and some said that even the trees had been a bad move, and that no one should have ever left the oceans. And then, one Thursday, nearly 2,000 years after one man had been nailed to a tree for saying how great it would be to be nice to people for a change, a girl, sitting on her own in a cafe in Rickmansworth, suddenly realized what it was that had been going wrong all this time, and she finally knew how the world could be made a good and happy place. This time it was right, it would work, and no one would have to get nailed to anything. Sadly, however, before she could get to a phone to tell anyone about it, a terrible, stupid catastrophe occurred, and the idea was lost forever. This is not her story, but it is the story of that terrible, stupid catastrophe and some of its consequences. It is also the story of a book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Not an Earth book, never published on Earth, and until the terrible catastrophe occurred, never seen or even heard of by any Earthman. Nevertheless, it is a wholly remarkable book. In fact, it was probably the most remarkable book ever to come out of the great publishing corporations of Ursa Minor, of which no Earthman had ever heard either. Not only is it a wholly remarkable book, it is also a highly successful one. More popular than the Celestial Home Care Omnibus, better selling than 53 More Things to Do in Zero Gravity, and more controversial than Ulan Kalufid's trilogy of philosophical blockbusters, Where God Went Wrong, Some More of God's Greatest Mistakes, and Who Is This God Person Anyway? Thank you, Angry Noodle. In many of the more relaxed civilizations on the outer eastern rim of the galaxy, The Hitchhiker's Guide has already supplanted the great Encyclopedia Galactica as the standard repository of all knowledge and wisdom. For though it has many omissions that contain much that is apocryphal, or at least wholly inaccurate, it scores over the older, more pedestrian work in two important respects. First, it is slightly cheaper, and second, it has the words "Don't Panic" inscribed in large, friendly letters on its cover. But the story of this terrible, stupid Thursday, the story of its extraordinary consequences, and the story of how those consequences are inextricably intertwined, this remarkable book begins very simply. It begins with a house. Chapter 1. The house stood on a slight rise, just on the edge of the village. It stood on its own and looked out over a broad spread of western country farmland. not a remarkable house by any means. It was about 30 years old, squattish, squarish, made of brick, and had 4 windows set in the front of a size and proportion which more or less exactly failed to please the eye. The only person for whom the house was in any way special was Arthur Dent, and that was only because it happened to be the one he lived in. He had lived in it for about 3 years, ever since he had moved out of London because it made him nervous and irritable. He was about 30 as well, tall, dark-haired, and never quite at ease with himself. The thing that used to worry him most was the fact that people always used to ask him what he was looking so worried about. He worked in local radio, which he always used to tell his friends was a lot more interesting than they probably thought. It was, too. Most of his friends worked in advertising. On Wednesday night, it had rained very heavily. The lane was wet and muddy, but the Thursday morning sun was bright and clear as it shone on Arthur Dent's house for what was to be the last time. It hadn't properly registered yet with Arthur that the council wanted to knock it down and build a bypass instead. At 8 o'clock on Thursday morning, Arthur didn't feel very good. He woke up blearily, got up, wandered round blearily round his room, opened a window, saw a bulldozer, found his slippers, and stomped off to the bathroom to wash. Toothpaste on the brush, so scrub. Shaving mirror, pointing at the ceiling, he adjusted it. For a moment it reflected a second bulldozer through the bathroom window. Properly adjusted, it reflected Arthur Dent's bristles. He shaved them off, washed, dried, and stomped off to the kitchen to find something pleasant to put in his mouth. Kettle, plug, fridge, milk, coffee, yawn. The word bulldozer wandered through his mind for a moment in search of something to connect with. The bulldozer outside the kitchen window was quite a big one. He stared at it. Yellow, he thought, and stomped off back to his bedroom to get dressed. Passing the bathroom, he stopped to drink a large glass of water, and another. He began to suspect that he was hungover. Why was he hungover? Had he been drinking the night before? He supposed that he must have been. He caught a glint in the shaving mirror. Yellow, he thought, and stomped off to the bedroom. He stood and thought. The pub, he thought. Oh dear, the pub. He vaguely remembered being angry about something that seemed important. He'd been telling people about it at great length, he rather suspected. His clearest visual recollection was of glazed looks on other people's faces. Something about a new bypass he just found out about. It had been in the pipeline for months, only no one seemed to have known about it. Ridiculous. He took a swig of water. It would sort itself out, he decided. No one wanted a bypass. The council didn't have a leg to stand on. It would sort itself out. God, what a terrible hangover it had earned him, though. He looked at himself in the wardrobe mirror. He stuck out his tongue. Yellow, he thought. The word yellow wandered through his mind in search of something to connect with. 15 seconds later, he was out of the house and lying in front of a big yellow bulldozer that was advancing up his garden path. Mr. L. Prosser was, as they say, only human. In other words, he was a carbon-based bipedal lifeform descended from an ape. More specifically, he was 40, fat, and shabby, and worked for the local council. Curiously enough, though he didn't know it, he was also a direct male-line descendant of Genghis Khan. Though intervening generations and racial mixing had so juggled his genes that he held no discernible mongoloid characteristics, and the only vestiges left in Mr. L. Prosser of his mighty ancestry were a pronounced stoutness about the tum and a predilection for little fur hats. He was by no means a great warrior. In fact, he was a nervous, worried man. Today, he was particularly nervous and worried because something had gone seriously wrong with his job, which was to see that Arthur Dent's house got cleared out of the way before the day was out. "Come off it, Mr. Dent," he said. "You can't win, you know. You can't lie in front of the bulldozer indefinitely." He tried to make his eyes blaze fiercely, but they just wouldn't do it. Arthur lay in the mud and squelched at him. "I'm game," he said. "We'll see who rusts first." "I'm afraid you're going to have to accept it," said Mr. Prosser, gripping his fur hat and rolling it around the top of his head. "This bypass has got to be built, and it's going to be built." "First I've heard of it," said Arthur. "Why has it got to be built?" Mr. Prosser shook his finger at him for a bit, then stopped and put it away again. "What do you mean, why's it got to be built?" he said. "It's a bypass. You've got to build bypasses." Bypasses are devices that allow some people to dash from point A to point B very fast, while other people dash from point B to point A very fast. People living at point C, being a point directly in between, are often given to wonder what's so great about point A that so many people from point B are so keen to get there. And what's so great about point B that so many people from point A are so keen to get there. They often wish that people would just, for once and all, work out where the hell they wanted to be. Mr. Prosser wanted to be at point D. Point D wasn't anywhere in particular. It was just any convenient point a very long way from points A, B, and C. He would have a nice little cottage at point D, with axes over the door, and spend a pleasant amount of time at point E, which would be the nearest pub to point D. His wife, of course, wanted climbing roses, but he wanted axes. He didn't know why. He just liked axes. He flushed hotly under the derisive grins of the bulldozer drivers. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, but it was equally uncomfortable on each. Obviously, somebody had been appallingly incompetent, and he hoped to God it wasn't him. Mr. Prosser said, "You are quite entitled to make any suggestions or protests at the appropriate time, you know." "Appropriate time?" hooted Arthur. "Appropriate time? The first I knew of it was when a workman arrived at my home yesterday. I asked him if he'd come to clean the windows, and he said no. He'd come to demolish the house. He didn't tell me straight away, of course. Oh, no. First, he wiped a couple of windows and charged me $5. Then he told me, 'But, Mr. Dent, the plans have been available in the local planning office for 9 months. Oh, yes. As soon as I heard, I went straight round to see them. Yesterday afternoon. You hadn't exactly gone out of your way to call attention to them now, had you? I mean, like actually telling anyone or anything? But the plans were on display. On display! I eventually had to go down to the cellar to find them. That's the display department. With a flashlight. Ah, well, the lights had probably gone. So had the stairs. But look, you found the notice, didn't you?" "Yes," said Arthur. "Yes, I did. It was on display in the bottom of a locked filing cabinet, stuck in a disused lavatory, with a sign on the door saying, 'Beware the leopard.'" A cloud passed overhead. It cast a shadow over Arthur Dent as he lay propped up on his elbows in the cold mud. It cast a shadow over Arthur Dent's house. Mr. Prosser frowned at it. "It's not as if it's a particularly nice house," he said. "I'm sorry, but I happen to like it." "You're like the bypass." "Oh, shut up," said Arthur Dent. "Shut up and go away and take your bloody bypass with you. You haven't got a leg to stand on, and you know it." Mr. Prosser's mouth opened and closed a couple of times, while his mind was for a moment filled with inexplicable but terribly attractive visions of Arthur Dent's house being consumed with fire, and Arthur himself running screaming from the blazing ruin, with at least 3 hefty spears protruding from his back. "He will not like the bypass, no," says the angry noodle. Mr. Prosser was often bothered with visions like these, and they made him feel very nervous. He stuttered for a moment, and then pulled himself together. "Mr. Dent," he said. "Hello? Yes?" said Arthur. "Some factual information for you. Have you any idea how much damage this bulldozer would suffer if I just let it roll straight over you?" "How much?" said Arthur. "None at all," said Mr. Prosser, and stormed nervously off, wondering why his brain was filled with 1,000 hairy horsemen, all shouting at him. By a curious coincidence, none at all is exactly how much suspicion the ape descendant Arthur Dent had that one of his closest friends was not descended from an ape, but was in fact from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Betelgeuse, and not from Guildford as he usually claimed. Arthur Dent had never, ever suspected this. This friend of his had first arrived on the planet Earth some 15 Earth years previously, and he had worked hard to blend himself into Earth society with, it must be said, some success. For instance, he had spent those 15 years pretending to be an out-of-work actor, which was plausible enough. He had made one careless blunder, though. Because he had skimped a bit on his preparatory research, the information he had gathered had led him to choose the name Ford Prefect as being nicely inconspicuous. He was not conspicuously tall. His features were striking, but not conspicuously handsome. His hair was wiry and gingerish, and brushed backward from the temples. His skin seemed to be pulled backward from the nose. There was something very slightly odd about him, but it was difficult to say what it was. Perhaps it was that his eyes didn't seem to blink often enough, and when you talked to him for any length of time, your eyes began to involuntarily water on his behalf. Perhaps it was that he smiled slightly too broadly and gave people the unnerving impression that he was about to go for their neck. He struck most of his friends he had made on Earth as an eccentric, but a harmless one. An unruly boozer with some oddish habits. For instance, he would often gate-crash university parties, get badly drunk, and start making fun of any astrophysicists he could find till he got thrown out. Sometimes he would get seized with oddly distracted moods and stare into the sky as if hypnotized until someone asked him what he was doing. Then he would start guiltily for a moment, relax, and grin. "Oh, just looking for flying saucers," he would joke. And everyone would laugh and ask him what sort of flying saucers he was looking for. "Green ones," he would reply with a wicked grin, laugh wildly for a moment, and then suddenly lunge for the nearest bar and buy everyone a round of drinks. Evenings like this usually ended badly. Ford would grit out of his skull on whiskey, huddle in a corner with some pretty girl, and explain to her in hushed phrases that honestly the color of the flying saucers didn't matter that much, really. Thereafter, staggering, semi-paralytic down the night streets, he would often ask passing policemen if they knew the way to Beetlejuice. The policeman would usually say something like, "Don't you think it's time you head home, sir?" "I'm trying to, baby, I'm trying to," is what Ford invariably replied on these occasions. In fact, what he was really looking for when he stared distractedly into the sky was any kind of flying saucer at all. The reason he said green was that green was the traditional space livery of the Beetlejuice trading scouts. Ford Prefect was desperate that any flying saucer at all would arrive soon, because 15 years was a long time to get stranded anywhere, particularly somewhere as mind-bogglingly dull as the Earth. Ford wished that a flying saucer would arrive soon because he knew how to flag flying saucers down and get lifts from them. He knew how to see the marvels of the universe for less than 30 Altarian dollars a day. In fact, Ford Prefect was a roving researcher for that wholly remarkable book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Human beings are great adapters, and by lunchtime, life in the environs of Arthur's house had settled into a steady routine. Angry Noodle says meta, and she is not wrong. It was Arthur's accepted role to lie squelching in the mud, making occasional demands to see his lawyer, his mother, or a good book. It was Mr. Prosser's accepted role to tackle Arthur with the occasional new ploy, such as the for the public good talk, or the March of Progress talk, or they knocked my house down once, never look back talk, and various other cajoleries and threats. And it was the bulldozer driver's accepted role to sit around drinking coffee and experimenting with union regulations to see how they could turn the situation to their financial benefit. The Earth moved slowly in its diurnal course. The sun was beginning to dry out the mud that Arthur lay in. A shadow moved across him again. "Hello, Arthur," said the shadow. Arthur looked up, and squinting into the sun, was startled to see Ford Prefect standing above him. "Ford. Hello, how are you?" "Fine," said Ford. "Look, are you busy?" "Am I busy?" exclaimed Arthur. "Well, I've just got these bulldozers and things to lie in front of, because they'll knock my house down if I don't, but Other than that, well, no, not especially. Why? They don't have sarcasm on Beetlejuice, and Ford Prefect often failed to notice it unless he was concentrating. He said, "Good. Is there anywhere we can talk?" "What?" said Arthur Dent. For a few seconds, Ford seemed to ignore him, and stared fixedly into the sky like a rabbit trying to get run over by a car. Then suddenly he squatted down beside Arthur. "We've got to talk," he said urgently. "Fine," said Arthur. "Talk." "And drink," said Ford. "It's vitally important that we talk and drink now. We'll go to the pub in the village." He looked into the sky again, nervous, expectant. "Look, don't you understand?" shouted Arthur. He pointed at Prosser. "That man wants to knock my house down." Ford glanced at him, puzzled. "Well, he can do that while you're away, can't he?" he asked. "But I don't want him to." "Ah!" "Look, what's the matter with you, Ford?" said Arthur. Nothing's the matter. Listen to me. I've got to tell you the most important thing you've ever heard. I've got to tell you now, and I've got to tell you in the saloon bar of the Horse and Groom." "But why?" "Because you're going to need a very stiff drink." Ford stared at Arthur, and Arthur was astonished to find his will beginning to weaken. He didn't realize that this was because of an old drinking game that Ford learned to play in the hyperspace ports that served the Madronite mining belts of the star system Orion Beta. The game was not unlike the Earth game called Indian Wrestling, and was played like this. 2 contestants would sit either side of the table, with a glass in front of each of them. Between them would be placed a bottle of jank spirit, as immortalized in the ancient Orion mining song, "Oh, don't give me none more of that old jank spirit. No, don't give me none more of that old jank spirit. For my head will fly, my tongue will lie, my eyes will fry, and I may die. Won't you pour me one more of that sinful old jank spirit?" Each of the 2 contestants would then concentrate their will on the bottle and attempt to tip it and pour the spirit into the glass of his opponent, who would then have to drink it. The bottle would then be refilled. The game would be played again and again. Once you started to lose, you would probably keep losing, because one of the effects of jank spirit is to depress telepsychic power. As soon as the predetermined quantity had been consumed, the final loser would have to perform a forfeit, which was usually obscenely biological. Ford Prefect usually played to lose. Ford stared at Arthur, who began to think that perhaps he did want to go to the Horse and Groom after all. "But what about my house?" he asked plaintively. Ford looked across to Mr. Prosser, and suddenly a wicked thought struck him. "He wants to knock your house down." "Yes, he wants to build, and he can't, because you're lying in front of his bulldozer." "Yes, and I'm sure we can come to some arrangement," said Ford. "Excuse me," he shouted. Mr. Prosser, who was arguing with a spokesperson for the bulldozer's drivers about whether or not Arthur Dent constituted a mental health hazard, and how much they should get paid if he did, looked around. He was surprised and slightly alarmed to see that Arthur had company. "Yes, hello," he called. "Has Mr. Dent come to his senses yet?" Can we for the moment, called Ford, "assume that he hasn't?" "Well," sighed Mr. Prosser. "And can we also assume," said Ford, "that he's going to be staying here all day?" "So?" "So all your men are going to be standing around all day doing nothing?" Could be. "Well, if you're resigned to doing that anyway, you don't actually need him to lie here all the time, do you?" "What?" "You don't," said Ford patiently, "actually need him here." Mr. Prosser thought about this. "Well, no, not as such," he said. "Not exactly need." Prosser was worried. He thought that one of them wasn't making a lot of sense. Ford said, "So if you would just like to take it as read that he's actually here, then he and I could slip off down to the pub for half an hour. How does that sound?" Mr. Prosser thought it sounded perfectly potty. "That sounds perfectly reasonable," he said in a reassuring tone of voice. wondering who he was trying to reassure. "And if you want to pop off for a quick one yourself later on," said Ford, "we can always cover for you in return." "Thank you very much," said Mr. Prosser, who no longer knew how to play this at all. "Thank you very, very much. Yes, that's very kind." He frowned, then smiled, then tried to do both at once, failed, grasped hold of his fur hat, and rolled it fitfully round the top of his head. He could only assume that he had just won. "So," continued Fort Prefect, "if you would just like to come over here and lie down." "What?" said Mr. Prosser. "Ah, I'm sorry," said Ford. "Perhaps I hadn't made myself fully clear. Somebody's got to lie in front of the bulldozer, haven't they? Or there won't be anything to stop them from driving into Mr. Dent's house, now will there?" "Well," said Mr. Prosser again. "It's very simple," said Ford. "My client, Mr. Dent, says that he will stop lying here in the mud on the sole condition that you come and take over from him." "What are you talking about?" said Arthur, but Ford nudged him with his shoe to be quiet. "You want me," Mr. Prosser, spelling out this new thought to himself, "to come and lie there." "Yes." "In front of the bulldozer." "Yes." "Instead of Mr. Dent." "Yes." "In the mud." "In, as you say, the mud." As soon as Mr. Prosser realized that he was substantially the loser after all, it was as if a weight lifted off his shoulders. This was more like the world he knew it. This was more like the world as he knew it. He sighed. "In return for which you will take Mr. Dent with you down to the pub?" "That's it," said Ford. "That's it exactly." Mr. Prosser took a few nervous steps forward and stopped. "Promise," he said. "Promise," said Ford. He turned to Arthur. "Come on," he said to him. "Get up and let the man lie down." Arthur stood up, feeling as if he was in a dream. Ford beckoned to Prosser, who, sadly, awkwardly, sat down in the mud. He felt that his whole life was some kind of dream, and he sometimes wondered whose it was and whether they were enjoying it. The mud folded itself round his bottom, and his arms and oozed into his shoes. Ford looked at him severely. "And no sneaky knocking Mr. Dent's house down while he's away, all right?" he said. "The mere thought," growled Mr. Prosser. "Hadn't even begun to speculate," he continued, settling himself back, "about the merest possibility of crossing my mind." He saw the bulldozer drivers' union representative approaching and let his head sink back and closed his eyes. He was trying to marshal his arguments for proving that he did not now constitute a mental health hazard himself. He was far from certain about this. His mind seemed to be full of noises, horses, smoke, and the stench of blood. This always happened when he felt miserable or put upon, and he had never been able to explain it to himself. In a high dimension of which we know nothing, the mighty Khan bellowed with rage, but Mr. Prosser only trembled slightly and whimpered. He began to feel little pricks of water behind his eyelids. Bureaucratic cock-ups, angry men lying in mud, indecipherable strangers handing out inexplicable humiliation, and an unidentified army of horsemen laughing at him in his head. What a day! What a day! Ford Prefect knew that it didn't matter a pair of dingo's kidneys whether Arthur's house got knocked down or not now. Arthur remained very worried. "But can we trust him?" he said. "Oh, myself, I'd trust him to the end of the earth," said Ford. "Oh, yes," said Arthur. "And how far's that?" "About 12 minutes away," said Ford. "Come on, I need a drink." End of Chapter 1. Excuse me a moment while I take a drink of water. Thank you, Angry Noodle. All right, Chapter 2. Here's what the Encyclopedia Galactica has to say about alcohol. It says that alcohol is a colorless, volatile liquid formed by the fermentation of sugars, and also notes its intoxicating effects on certain carbon-based life forms. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy also mentions alcohol. It says that the best drink in existence is the Pan-Galactic Gargle Blaster. It says that the effect of drinking a Pan-Galactic Gargle Blaster is like having your brain smashed out by a slice of lemon wrapped around a large gold brick. The guide also tells you on which planets the best Pan-Galactic Gargle Blasters are mixed, how much you can expect to pay for one, and what voluntary organizations exist to help you rehabilitate afterwards. The guide even tells you how you can mix one yourself. Take the juice from one bottle of the Old Jank Spirit, it says. Pour into 1 measure of water from the seas of Santraginus 5. Oh, that Santragian water, it says. Oh, those Santragian fish. Allow 3 cubes of Arcturan Megajet to melt into the mixture. It must be properly iced, or the benzene is lost. Allow 4 liters of Fallian Marsh gas to bubble through it, in memory of all those happy hikers who have died of pleasure in the marshes of Phallia. Over the back of a silver spoon float a measure of quolactin hypermint extract, redolent of all the heady odors of the dark quolactin zones, subtle, sweet, and mystic. Drop in the tooth of an Algolian sun tiger. Watch it dissolve, spreading the fires of the Algolian suns deep into the heart of the drink. Sprinkle Zamphor. Add an olive. And drink, but very carefully. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy sells rather better than the Encyclopedia Galactica. 6 pints of bitter, said Ford Prefect to the barman of the Horse and Groom. And quickly, please, the world's about to end. The barman of Horse and Groom didn't deserve this sort of treatment. He was a dignified old man. He pushed his glasses up his nose and blinked at Ford Prefect. Ford ignored him and stared out the window. So the barman looked instead at Arthur, who shrugged helplessly and said nothing. So the barman said, "Oh, yes, sir. Nice weather for it." He started pulling the pints. He tried again. "Going to watch the match this afternoon, then?" Ford glanced round at him. "No point," he said, and looked back out the window. "What's that? You reckon foregone conclusion, then?" said the barman. "Arsenal without a chance?" No, said Ford. "It's just that the world's about to end." "Oh, yes, sir, so you say." The barman, looking over his glasses... Sorry, I misread that whole sentence. "Oh, yes, sir, so you said," said the barman, looking over his glasses at this time at Arthur. "Lucky escape for Arsenal if it did." Ford looked back at him, genuinely surprised. "No, not really," he said. He frowned. The barman breathed in heavily. "There you are, sir, 6 pints," he said. Arthur smiled at him wanly, and shrugged again. He turned and smiled wanly at the rest of the pub, just in case any of them had heard what was going on. None of them had, and none of them could understand what he was smiling at them for. A man sitting next to Ford at the bar looked at the 2 men, looked at the 6 pints, did a swift burst of mental arithmetic, arrived at an answer he liked, and grinned a stupid, hopeful grin at them. "Get off," said Ford. "They're ours," giving him a look that would have made an Algolian sun tiger get on with what it was doing. Ford slapped a 5-pound note on the bar. He said, "Keep the change." "What, from a 5er? Thank you, sir." "You got 10 minutes to spend it." The barman decided simply to walk away for a bit. "Ford," said Arthur, "would you please tell me what the hell is going on?" "Drink up," said Ford. "We got 3 pints to get through." 3 pints, said Arthur, "at lunchtime?" The man next to Ford grinned and nodded happily. Ford ignored him. He said, "Time is an illusion. Lunchtime doubly so." "Very deep," said Arthur. "You should send that into the Reader's Digest. They've got a page for people like you." "Drink up." "Why 3 pints all of a sudden?" "Muscle relaxant. You'll see. You'll need it." Muscle relaxant. Muscle relaxant. Arthur stared into his beer. "Did I do anything wrong today?" he said. "Or has the world always been like this, and I've been too wrapped up in myself to notice?" "All right," said Ford. "I'll try to explain. How long have we known each other?" "How long?" Arthur thought. About 5 years, maybe 6," he said. Most of it seemed to make some kind of sense at the time. "All right," said Ford. "How would you react if I said I'm not from Guildford after all, but from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Betelgeuse?" Arthur shrugged in a so-so sort of way. "I don't know," he said, taking a pull of his beer. "Why, do you think it's the sort of thing you're likely to say?" Ford gave up. It really wasn't worth bothering at the moment, what with the world being about to end. He said, "Drink up." He added perfectly factually, "The world's about to end." Arthur gave the rest of the pub another wan smile. The rest of the pub frowned at him. A man waved at him to stop smiling at them and mind his own business. "This must be Thursday," said Arthur to himself, sinking low over his beer. "Never could get the hang of Thursdays." End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. On this particular Thursday, something was moving quietly through the ionosphere many miles above the surface of the planet. Several somethings, in fact. Several dozen huge, yellow, chunky, slab-like somethings, huge as office blocks, silent as birds. They soared with ease, basking in the electromagnetic rays from the star Sol, biding their time, grouping, preparing. Angry Noodle says that she also hates Thursdays. I'm more of a Wednesday-hating person myself. The planet beneath them was almost perfectly oblivious of their presence, which was just how they wanted it for the moment. The huge yellow something went unnoticed at Goonhilly. They passed over Cape Canaveral without a blip. Woomera and Jodrell Bank looked straight through them, which was a pity because it was exactly the sort of thing they'd been looking for all these years. Angry Noodle says Wednesdays too, but at least those are hump days. And she spelled days with, 10 A's. The only place they registered at all was on a small black device called a sub-ether sensomatic, which winked away quietly to itself. It nestled in the darkness inside a leather satchel which Ford Prefect habitually wore slung round his neck. The contents of Ford Prefect's satchel were quite interesting, in fact, and would have made any Earth physicist's eyes pop out of his head, which is why he always concealed them by keeping a couple of dog-eared scripts for plays he pretended he was auditioning for stuffed on the top. Besides the sub-ether sensomatic, the scripts he had... Besides the sub-ether sensomatic and the scripts, he had an electronic thumb, a short, squat black rod, smooth and matte with a couple of flat switches and dials at one end. He also had a device that looked rather like a largest electronic calculator. This had about 100 tiny flat press buttons and a screen about 4 inches square on which any one of a million pages could be summoned at a moment's notice. It looked insanely complicated, and this was one of the reasons why the snug plastic cover it fitted into had the words "Don't Panic" written in large, friendly letters. The other reason was that this device was in fact the most remarkable of all books ever to come out of the great publishing corporations of Ursa Minor, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The reason why it was published in the form of a micro-sub-meson electronic component is that if it were printed in normal book form, an interstellar hitchhiker would require several inconveniently large buildings to carry it around in. Pardon me while I take a sip of water. Okay. Beneath that, in Ford Prefect's satchel, were a few ballpoints, a notepad, and a largish bath towel from Marks and Spencer. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy has a few things to say on the subject of towels. A towel, it says, is about the most massively useful thing an interstellar hitchhiker can have. Partly, it has great practical value. You can wrap it around you for warmth as you bound across the cold moons of Jaglan Beta. You can lie on it on the brilliant marble-sanded beaches of Santraginus V, inhaling the heady sea vapors. You can sleep under it, beneath the stars, while they shine readily on the desert world of Kakrafoon. Use it to sail a mini-raft down the slow, heavy river Moth. Wet it for use in hand-to-hand combat. Wrap it round your head to ward off noxious fumes or avoid the gaze of the ravenous bug-bladder beast of Trawl. A mind-bogglingly stupid animal. It assumes that if you can't see it, it can't see you. Daft as a brush, but very, very ravenous. You can wave your towel in emergencies as a distress signal, and of course, dry yourself off with it, if it still seems to be clean enough. More importantly, though, a towel has immense psychological value. For some reason, if a strag meaning non-hitchhiker, discovers that a hitchhiker has his towel with him, he will automatically assume that he is also in possession of a toothbrush, washcloth, soap, tin of biscuits, flask, compass, map, ball of string, gnat spray, wet weather gear, spacesuit, etc., etc. Furthermore, the strag will then happily lend the hitchhiker any of these or a dozen other items that the hitchhiker might accidentally have lost. What the strag will think is that any man who can hitch the length and breadth of the What the strag will think is that any man who can hitch the length and breadth of the galaxy, rough it, slum it, struggle against terrible odds, win through, and still know where his towel is clearly a man to be reckoned with. Hence a phrase that is passed into hitchhiking slang, as in, "Hey, you sass that hoopy Ford Prefect? There's a Frood who really knows where his towel is." Sass meaning know, be aware of, meet, have sex with. Hoopy, really together guy. Frood, really amazingly together guy. Nestling quietly on top of the towel in Ford Prefect's satchel, the sub-ether sensomatic began to wink more quickly. Miles above the surface of the planet, the huge yellow somethings began to fan out. At Jodrell Bank, someone decided it was time for a nice relaxing cup of tea. "You got a towel with you?" said Ford suddenly to Arthur. Arthur, struggling through his third pint, looked round at him. "Why, what? No, should I have?" He had given up being surprised. There didn't seem to be any point any longer. Ford clicked his tongue in irritation. "Drink up," he urged. At that moment, the dull sound of a rumbling crash from outside filtered through the low murmur of the pub, through the sound of the jukebox, through the sound of the man next to Ford hiccuping over the whiskey Ford had eventually bought him. Arthur choked on his beer, leapt to his feet. "What's that?" he yelled. "Don't worry," said Ford. "They haven't started yet." "Oh, thank God for that," said Arthur, and relaxed. "It's probably just your house being knocked down," said Ford, downing his last pint. "What?" shouted Arthur. Suddenly, Ford's spell was broken. Arthur looked wildly round at him and ran to the window. "My God, they are! They're knocking my house down! What the hell am I doing in the pub, Ford?" "It hardly makes any difference at this stage," said Ford. "Let them have their fun." "Fun?" yelped Arthur. "Fun?" He quickly checked out the window again, that they were talking about the same thing. "Damn their fun!" he hooted, and ran out of the pub furiously waving a nearly empty beer glass. He made no friends at all in the pub that lunchtime. Angry Noodles seems to be enjoying herself. I'm glad. "Stop, you vandals! You home-wreckers!" howled Arthur. "You half-crazed Visigoths! Stop, will you?" Ford would have to go after him. Turning quickly to the barman, he asked for 4 packets of peanuts. "There you are, sir," said the barman. slapping the packets on the bar. 28 pence, if you'd be so kind. Ford was very kind. He gave the barman another 5-pound note, and told him to keep the change. The barman looked at it, and then looked at Ford. He suddenly shivered. He experienced a momentary sensation that he didn't understand because no one on Earth had ever experienced it before. In moments of great stress, every life form that exists gives out a tiny, subliminal signal. The signal simply communicates an exact and almost pathetic sense of how far that being is from the place of his birth. On Earth, it is never possible to be farther than 16,000 miles from your birthplace, which really isn't very far. So, such signals are too minute to be noticed. Ford Prefect was at this moment under great stress, and he was born 600 light-years away, in the near vicinity of Betelgeuse. The barman reeled for a moment, hit by a shocking, incomprehensible sense of distance. He didn't know what it meant, but he looked at Ford, Prefect, with a new sense of respect, almost awe. "Are you serious, sir?" he said in a small whisper, which had the effect of silencing the pub. "You think the world's about to end?" "Yes," said Ford Prefect. "But this afternoon?" Ford had recovered himself. He was at his flippiest. "Yes," he said gently. He said gaily. "In less than 2 minutes, I would estimate." The barman couldn't believe this conversation he was having, but he couldn't believe the sensation he had just had either. "Isn't there anything we can do about it, then?" he said. "No, nothing," said Ford, stuffing the peanuts into his pocket. Someone in the hushed bar suddenly laughed raucously at how stupid everyone had become. The man sitting next to Ford was a bit sozzled by now. His eyes weaved their way up to Ford. "I thought," he said, "that if the world was going to end, we were meant to lie down or put a paper bag over our head or something." "If you like, yes," said Ford. "That's what they told us in the army," said the man, and his eyes began the long trek back toward his whiskey. "Will that help?" asked the barman. No," said Ford, and gave him a friendly smile. "Excuse me," he said, "I've got to go." With a wave, he left. The pub was silent for a moment longer, and then, embarrassingly enough, the man with the raucous laugh did it again. Tim had grown to loathe him dearly over the last hour, and it would probably have been a great satisfaction to her to know that in a minute and a half or so he would suddenly evaporate into a whiff of hydrogen, ozone, and carbon monoxide. However, when the moment came, she would be too busy evaporating herself to notice it. The barman cleared his throat. He heard himself say, "Last orders, please." The huge yellow machines began to sink downward and to move faster. Ford knew they were there. This wasn't the way he had wanted it. Running up the lane, Arthur had nearly reached his house. He didn't notice how cold it had suddenly become. He didn't notice the wind. He didn't notice the sudden irrational squall of rain. He didn't notice anything but the caterpillar bulldozers crawling over the rubble that had been his home. "You barbarians!" he yelled. "I'll sue the council for every penny it's got. I'll have you hung, drawn, and quartered, and whipped, and boiled until you've had enough." Ford was running after him very fast, very, very fast. "And then I will do it again," yelled Arthur. "And when I've finished, I will take all the little bits and I will jump on them." Arthur didn't notice that the men were running from the bulldozers. He didn't notice that Mr. Prosser was staring hectically into the sky. What Mr. Prosser had noticed was that huge yellow somethings were screaming through the clouds, impossibly huge yellow somethings. "And I will carry on jumping on them," yelled Arthur, still running, "until I get blisters, or I can think of anything even more unpleasant to do. And then—" Arthur tripped and fell headlong, rolled, and landed flat on his back. At last he noticed that something was going on. His finger shot upward. "What the hell's that?" he shrieked. Whatever it was raced across the sky in its monstrous yellowness, tore the sky apart with mind-boggling noise, and leapt off into the distance, leaving the gaping air to shut behind it with a loud bang that drove your ears 6 feet into your skull. Another one followed and did exactly the same thing, only louder. It's difficult to say exactly what the people on the surface of the planet were doing now, because they didn't really know what they were doing themselves. None of it made a lot of sense. Running into houses, running out of houses, howling noiselessly at the noise. All around the world, city streets exploded with people. Cars skidded into each other at the noise, fell on them, and then rolled off like a tidal wave over hills and valleys, deserts and oceans, seeming to flatten everything it hit. Only one man stood and watched the sky, stood with terrible sadness in his eyes, and rubber bungs in his ears. He knew exactly what was happening, and he had known ever since his sub-ether sensomatic had started winking in the dead of night beside his pillow, and wakened him with a start. It was what he had waited for all these years, but when he had deciphered the signal pattern sitting alone in his small, dark room, a coldness had gripped him and squeezed his heart. Of all the races in the galaxy who could have come and said a big hello to the Earth, he thought, didn't it just have to be the Vogons? Still, he knew what he had to do, and the Vogon craft screamed through the air high above him. He opened his satchel. He threw away a copy of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. He threw away a copy of Godspell. He wouldn't need them where he was going. Everything was ready. Everything was prepared. He knew where his towel was. A sudden silence hit the Earth. If anything, it was worse than the noise. For a while, nothing happened. The great ships hung motionless in the sky. Over every nation on Earth, motionless they hung, huge, heavy, steady in the sky. A blasphemy against nature. Many people went straight into shock as their minds tried to encompass what they were looking at. The ships hung in the sky in much the same way that bricks don't. And still, nothing happened. Then there was a slight whisper, a sudden, spacious whisper of open ambient sound. Every hi-fi set in the world, every radio, every television, every cassette recorder, every woofer, every tweeter, every mid-range driver in the world quietly turned itself on. Every tin can, every dustbin, every window, every car, every wine glass, every sheet of rusty metal became activated as an acoustically perfect sounding board. Before the Earth passed away, it was going to be treated to the very ultimate in sound reproduction. The greatest public address system ever built. But there was no concert, no music, no fanfare. Just a simple message. "People of Earth, your attention, please," a voice said. And it was wonderful, wonderful, perfect, quadraphonic sound with distortion levels so low as to make a brave man weep. "This is Prostechnik Vogon Jeltz of the Galactic Hyperspace Planning Council," the voice continued. "As you will no doubt be aware, the plans for development of the outlying regions of the galaxy require the building of a hyperspatial expressway through your star system, and regrettably, your planet is one of those scheduled for demolition. The process will take slightly less than 2 of your Earth minutes. Thank you." The PA died away. Uncomprehending terror settled on the watching people of Earth. The terror moved slowly through the gathered crowds, as if they were iron filings on a sheet of board and a magnet was moving beneath them. Panic sprouted again, desperate, fleeing panic, but there was nowhere to flee to. Observing this, the Vogons turned on their PA system again. It said, "There's no point acting all surprised about it. All the planning charts and demolition orders have been on display in your local planning department in Alpha Centauri for 50 of your Earth years. So you've had plenty of time to lodge any formal complaints, and it's far too late to start making a fuss about it now." The PA fell silently again, and its echo drifted across the land. The huge ships turned slowly in the sky, with easy power. On the underside of each, a hatchway opened, an empty black square. Coastal Break says this is great. Thank you, Coastal Break. By this time, somebody somewhere must have manned a radio transmitter, located a wavelength, and broadcast a message back to the Vogon ships, to plead on behalf of the planet. Nobody ever heard what they said. They only heard the reply. The PA slammed back into life again. The voice was annoyed. It said, "What do you mean you've never been to Alpha Centauri? For heaven's sake, mankind, it's only 4 light years away, you know. I'm sorry, but if you can't be bothered to take an interest in local affairs, that's your own lookout. Energize the demolition beams." Light poured out of the hatchways. "I don't know," said the voice on the PA. "Apathetic bloody planet. I've no sympathy at all." It cut off. There was a terrible, ghastly silence. There was a terrible, ghastly noise. There was a terrible, ghastly silence. The Vogon constructor fleet coasted away into the inky, starry void. End of Chapter 3. Pardon me a moment while I take another drink break. All right. Chapter 4. Far away, on the opposite spiral arm of the galaxy, 500,000 light-years from the star Sol, Zaphod Beeblebrox, president of the Imperial Galactic Government, sped across the seas of Damagran, his ion-drive delta boat winking and flashing in the Damagran sun. Damagran the hot, Damagran the remote, Damagran the almost totally unheard of. Damagran, secret home of the Heart of Gold. The boat sped on across the water. It would be some time before it reached its destination because Damagran is such an inconveniently arranged planet. It consists of nothing but middling to large desert islands separated by very pretty but annoyingly wide stretches of ocean. The boat sped on. Because of this topographical awkwardness, Damagran has always remained a deserted planet. This is why the Imperial Galactic Government chose Damagran for the Heart of Gold project, because it was so deserted and the Heart of Gold project was so secret. The boat zipped and skipped across the sea that lay between the main islands of the only archipelago of any useful size on the whole planet. Zaphod Beeblebrox was on his way from the tiny spaceport on Easter Island. The name was an entirely meaningless coincidence. In galactic speak, Easter means small, flat, and lightly brown. To the Heart of Gold Island, which, by another meaningless coincidence, was named France. One of the side effects of work on the Heart of Gold was a whole string of pretty meaningless coincidences. But it was not in any way a coincidence that today, the day of the culmination of the project, the great day of unveiling, the day that the Heart of Gold was finally to be introduced to a marveling galaxy, was also a great day of culmination for Zaphod Beeblebrox. It was for the sake of this day that he had first decided to run for the presidency, a decision that had sent shockwaves of astonishment throughout the Imperial Galaxy. Zaphod Beeblebrox? President? Not the Zaphod Beeblebrox. Not the president. Many had seen it as clinching proof that the whole of known creation had finally gone bananas. Zaphod grinned and gave the boat an extra kick of speed. Zaphod Beeblebrox, adventurer, ex-hippie, Good timer. Crook? Quite possibly. Manic, self-publicist, terrible bad at personal relationships, often thought to be completely out to lunch. President? No one had gone bananas. Not in that way, at least. Only 6 people in the entire galaxy understood the principle on which the galaxy was governed. And they knew that once Zaphod Beeblebrox had announced his intention to run as president, it was more or less a fiat accompli. He was ideal presidency fodder. There's a footnote here for president. Full title, President of the Imperial Galactic Government. The term imperial is kept, though it is now an anachronism. The hereditary emperor is nearly dead, and has been for many centuries. In the last moments of his dying coma, he was locked in a stasis field, which keeps him in a state of perpetual unchangingness. All his heirs are now long dead, and this means that, without any drastic political upheaval, power has simply and effectively moved a rung or two down the ladder, and is now seen to be vested in a body that used to act simply as advisors to the emperor. An elected governmental assembly headed by the president, elected by that assembly, in fact, invests no such place. The president in particular is very much a figurehead. He wields no real power whatsoever. He is apparently chosen by the government, but the qualities he is required to display are not those of leadership, but those of finely judged outrage. For this reason, the president is always a controversial choice, always an infuriating but fascinating character. His job is not to wield power, but to draw attention away from it. On those criteria, Zaphod Beeblebrox is one of the most successful presidents the galaxy has ever had. He has already spent 2 of his 10 presidential years in prison for fraud. Very, very few people realize that the president of the government have virtually no power at all. And of those few people, only 6 know whence ultimate political power is wielded. Most of the others secretly believe that the ultimate decision-making process is handled by a computer. They couldn't be more wrong. End of the footnote. What they completely failed to understand was why Zaphod was doing it. He banked sharply, shooting a wild wall of water at the sun. Today was the day. Today was the day when they would realize what Zaphod had been up to. Today was what Zaphod Beeblebrox's presidency was all about. Today was also his 200th birthday. But that was just another meaningless coincidence. As he skipped his boat across the seas of Damagran, he smiled quietly to himself about what a wonderful, exciting day it was going to be. He relaxed and spread his 2 arms lazily along the seatback. He steered with an extra arm he'd had recently fitted just beneath his right one to help improve his ski boxing. Hey, he cooed to himself, you're a real cool boy, you know? But his nerves sang a song shriller than a dog whistle. The island of France was about 20 miles long, 5 miles across the middle, sandy and crescent-shaped. In fact, it seemed to exist not so much as an island in its own right, as simply a means of defining the sweep and curve of a huge bay. This impression was heightened by the fact that the inner coastline of the crescent consisted almost entirely of steep cliffs. From the top of the cliff, the land sloped slowly down 5 miles to the opposite shore. On top of the cliffs stood a reception committee. It consisted, in large part, of the engineers and researchers who had built the Heart of Gold. Mostly humanoid, but here and there were a few reptiloid atomineers, 2 or 3 green, sylph-like maxi-megalithicians, an octopodic fisturilist. It's not a real word. Or 2, and a hulavu. A hulavu is a super-intelligent shade of the color blue. All except the hulavu were resplendent in their multicolored ceremonial lab coats. The hulavu had been temporarily refracted into a freestanding prism for the occasion. There was a mood of immense excitement thrilling through all of them. Together and between them, They had gone to and beyond the furthest limits of physical laws, restructured the fundamental fabric of matter, strained, twisted, and broken the laws of possibility and impossibility. But still, the greatest excitement of all seemed to be to meet a man with an orange sash around his neck. An orange sash was what the president of the galaxy traditionally wore. It might not even have made much difference to them if they'd known exactly how much power the president of the galaxy actually wielded. None at all. Only 6 people in the galaxy knew that the job of the galactic president was not to wield power, but to attract attention away from it. Zaphod Beeblebrox was amazingly good at his job. The crowd gasped, dazzled by sun and seamanship. Let me start over. The crowd gasped, dazzled by sun and seamanship, as the presidential speedboat zipped round a headland into the bay. It flashed and shone as it came skating over the sea in wide, skidding turns. In fact, it didn't need to touch the water at all, because it was supported on a hazy cushion of ionized atoms. But just for effect, it was fitted with thin fin blades, which could be lowered into the water. They slashed sheets of water hissing into the air, carved deep gashes in the sea which swayed crazily and sank back foaming in the boat's wake as it careened across the bay. Zaphod loved the effect. It was what he was best at. He twisted the wheel sharply. The boat skidded around in a wild, scathing skid beneath the cliff face and dropped to rest lightly on the rocking waves. Within seconds, he ran out onto the deck and waved and grinned at over 3 billion people. The 3 billion people weren't actually there, but they watched his every gesture through the eyes of a small robot Tri-D camera, which hovered obsequiously in the air nearby. The antics of the president always made amazingly popular Tri-D. That's what they were for. He grinned again. 3,000,000,006 people didn't know it, but today would be a bigger antic than anyone had bargained for. The robot camera homed in for a close-up on the more popular of his 2 heads, and he waved again. He was roughly humanoid in appearance, except for the extra head and 3rd arm. His fair, tousled hair stuck out in random directions. His blue eyes glinted with something completely unidentifiable, and his chins were almost always unshaven. A 20-foot-high, transparent globe floated next to his boat, rolling and bobbing, glistening in the brilliant sun. Inside it floated a wide, semicircular sofa, upholstered in glorious red leather. The more the globe bobbed and rolled, the more the sofa stayed perfectly still, steady as an upholstered rock. Again, all done for effect as much as anything. Zaphod stepped through the wall of the globe and relaxed on the sofa. He spread his 2 arms along the back, and with the 3rd brushed some dust off his knees. His heads looked about, smiling. He put his feet up. At any moment, he thought, he might scream. Water boiled up beneath the bubble. It seethed and spouted. The bubble surged into the air, bobbing and rolling on the waterspout. Up it climbed, throwing stilts of light at the cliff. Up it surged up on the jet, the water falling from beneath it, crashing back into the sea hundreds of feet below. Zaphod smiled, picturing himself. A thoroughly ridiculous form of transport, but a thoroughly beautiful one. At the top of the cliff, the globe wavered for a moment, tipped onto a railed ramp, rolled down it to a small concave platform, and riddled to a halt. To tremendous applause, Zaphod Beeblebrox stepped out of the bubble. His orange slash... It says slash, not sash. His orange slash blazing in the light. The president of the galaxy had arrived. He waited for the applause to die down, then raised his hand in greeting. "Hi," he said. A government spider sidled up to him and attempted to press a copy of his prepared speech into his hands. Pages 3 to 7 of the original version were at the moment floating soggily on the Damagran Sea some 5 miles out from the bay. Pages 1 and 2 had been salvaged by a Damagran frond-crested eagle, and had already become incorporated into an extraordinary new form of nest which the eagle had invented. It was constructed largely of papier-mâché, and it was virtually impossible for the newly hatched baby eagle to break out of it. The Damagran frond-crested eagle had heard of the notion of survival of the species, but wanted no truck with it. Angry Noodle asks if I discovered a typo, and I believe I did. Yes, it definitely says slash instead of sash. Zaphod Beeblebrox would not be needing his set speech, and he gently deflected, the one being offered to him by the spider. "Hi," he said again. Everyone beamed at him, or at least nearly everyone. He singled out Trillian from the crowd. Trillian was a girl that Zaphod had picked up recently while visiting a planet, just for fun, incognito. She was slim, darkish, humanoid, with long waves of black hair, a full mouth, an odd little knob of a nose, and ridiculously brown eyes. With her red head scarf knotted in that particular way, and her long, flowing, silky brown dress, she looked vaguely Arabic. Not that anyone there had ever heard of an Arab, or of course. The Arabs had very recently ceased to exist, and even when they had existed, they were 500,000 light-years from Damagran. Trillian wasn't anybody in particular, or so Zaphod claimed. She just went around with him, rather a lot, and told him what she thought of him. "Hi, honey," he said to her. She flashed him a quick, tight smile, and looked away. Then she looked back for a moment, and smiled more warmly. But by this time, he was looking at something else. "Hi," he said to a small knot of creatures from the press, who were standing nearby, wishing that he would stop saying hi and get on with the quotes. He grinned at them particularly because he knew that in a few moments he would be giving them one hell of a quote. Pardon me while I clear my throat and take another drink. The next thing he said, though, was not a lot of use to them. One of the officials of the party had irritably decided that the president was clearly not in a mood to read the deliciously turned speech that had been written for him, and had flipped the switch on a remote-control device in his pocket. Away, in front of them, a huge white dome that bulged against the sky cracked down the middle, split, and slowly folded itself down into the ground. Everyone gasped, although they knew perfectly well that it was going to do that, because they'd built it that way. Beneath it lay uncovered a huge starship, 150 meters long, shaped like a sleek running shoe, perfectly white and mind-bogglingly beautiful. At the heart of it, unseen, lay a small gold box, which carried within it the most brain-wrenching device ever conceived. A device made this starship unique in the history of the galaxy, a device after which the ship was named, the Heart of Gold. "Wow," said Zaphod Beeblebrox to the Heart of Gold. There wasn't much else he could say. He said it again because he knew it would annoy the press. "Wow." The crowd turned their faces back toward him expectantly. He winked at Trillian, who raised her eyebrows and widened her eyes at him. She knew what he was about to do and say, and thought him a terrible show-off. "That is a really amazing ship," he said. "That really is truly amazing. That is so amazingly amazing, I think I'd like to steal it." A marvelous presidential quote, absolutely true to form. The crowd laughed appreciatively. The newsmen gleefully punched buttons on their sub-Ethan newsmatics, and the president grinned. As he grinned, his heart screamed unbearably, and he fingered the small, paralysomatic bomb that nestled quietly in his pocket. Finally, he could bear it no more. He lifted his head to the sky, let out a wild whoop in major thirds, threw the bomb to the crowd, and ran forward through the sea of suddenly frozen, beaming smiles. End of Chapter 4. And I think that might be where we end for the day. Let's see how long the next chapter is. A bit heavy for now. Alright, that will be where we end the day. Thank you for reading along with me. If you read along with me, thank you for listening if you listened. I hope that you had a good time. This is my favorite book of all time. And if you enjoyed this reading, please leave a comment, or I don't really know how all this live streaming stuff works, so do whatever, leave a like, comment, or subscribe, or whatever, and I may do more in the future. As I said at the top of this episode, this is an experiment just to see if I like it, and I liked it. And if other people like it too, I'll probably be more inclined to do it. So, thanks for joining me. Have a great day.